Everyone. Thank you for being with us. The title that came to me as I was sending out the email. So I kind of the creative process. If even if it is a process, I don't know. Sometimes it's just there. The information or the idea is just there. If you've ever read any about Tesla and the way he invented it, he believed his inventions were more of a revelation, that something was being revealed to him. And that's how he knew. And sometimes that's the way, in preparing for Sunday, that's the way it happens. It's just there. It's just there. When I worked in Raleigh, and I worked at Nortel, and I would do the Sunday talks from time to time at the church in Durham. I'd be standing there in the cafeteria waiting for them to make a sandwich for me, and with a little tray and the silverware and everything, and all of a sudden, boom, the talk would be there. If I was doing a talk on Sunday, and I'd have to take a napkin and a pen, and I'd start writing down the bullet points. It was just like boom, it just had boomed in from somewhere. So I was thinking yesterday, I was kind of inviting the topic to reveal itself to me. And when it first came to me, it was clarify, commit, and be consistent. The 3 C's. And it reminds me of when I was a kid. They still had in our books, our history books, they were talking about the Civilian Conservation Corps during the Depression. Roosevelt had the Civilian Conservation Corps kind of put people to work building projects. And it had the 3 C's. It was like a big C and then a smaller C and then an even smaller C, and you can imagine the 3 C's, one inside each other, a Civilian Conservation Corps. And kind of think of that symbol, if you will. You might want to draw it on a 3x5 or a sticky note and put it in front of you during the week. Clarify, commit, be consistent. But as I started to compose the email to send it out, I said, there's got to be a simpler way to say this, kind of a long title to put into an email. And then it just kind of was there, and it said, keep thine eye single, keep thine eye single, which is from New Testament. It's from Matthew chapter 6, verse 22. Keep thine eye single. And there it was, just, very simple, just a very simple statement, keep thine eye single. And to me that encapsulates what we're talking about. Clarify, commit, be consistent. So we want to talk a little bit about this. Now, these ideas that we're going to share today, and I don't know, it may spill over into next week. There's just so much richness in these ideas. But these ideas are applicable to your secular life as well as your spiritual life. It's the same idea. In any successful human endeavor is the best way that I can put it. If you go back and you kind of look at what people did and how they got there, they knew what they wanted. They clarified, of all of the possibilities in the world, of all of the things that we could have now, of all of the things that we could bring forth, like Tesla, of all the things that we could bring forth from out there, wherever out there is. What would we have come through us? What would we have come through us today? And once they got clear about the whole thing, they committed to it. When we talked about freedom last week, we talked about the signers of the Declaration of Independence. They committed with their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. And for those of you down at the Wilmington area, when we used to live down there, there's a man named Thomas Hooper who was from that area who signed the Declaration of Independence, and the British warships actually entered Mason-Barrow Sound, entered in by Wrightsville Beach through that inlet, and sailed up towards Carolina Beach, and they shelled his home, which was right on the intercoastal waterway there. So much history, commitment. They committed themselves to this idea, even though it cost them their personal fortunes. And then the last thing you have to consider is there's a consistency that the people who the people who achieve, the people who kind of succeed where others fail, do so because they stayed at it. They just stayed with it. You know, no matter what came up, they were so committed that no matter what came up, what got in the way, what obstacles, they kept going. They kept going. In a lot of the self-help and motivational books, there's a story about Teddy Roosevelt. When Teddy Roosevelt was in college, he figured out who the most likely competition he would have to be valedictorian would be. Who was the best student in the college. And Roosevelt realized that he could see that student's dorm window, from his own dorm window. And he made himself a promise, a pledge, that he would study every night for 30 minutes after that other boy's light went out. That was it. 30 minutes, an extra 30 minutes. He was going to give himself the edge, you know. He was consistent with it. He was consistent with it. He didn't quit. In Think and Grow Rich, in Napoleon Hill's book, which is entirely about this subject, right, that I'm talking about, except he's talking about it in the secular vein, how to achieve success and money and fame and whatever your heart desires in the secular world. There's a story about a man who went into speculating gold mining and got some investors and bought some equipment and started to dig a shaft, and after a while got discouraged and sold the equipment for cents on the dollar to another man. And that man called in a geologist who did a survey, and he told him, he said, keep digging, it's down there. And they dug, and you know, as the story goes, they dug for 2 more feet, and 2 more feet they struck the vein of gold. And the man learned a valuable lesson from that, and this is what Napoleon Hill was putting forth in the book. Don't quit, you know. Keep at it, be consistent, be consistent. Now we're gonna talk about these traits, if you will, of clarity, of commitment, and of consistency, but we're going to talk about them in what is the most important endeavor in our human lives, which is not human at all, which is to truly discover and to experience our spiritual nature. But the same principles apply. You have to clarify what you want. You have to commit yourself to it. Right? In the East, there's a saying that says that don't go looking for God unless you're doing so as you would be looking for a pond when your hair is on fire. Are you dedicated? Are you fully committed? So you don't get distracted. And then are you consistent? Are you consistent with it? Or is it something, you know, at 6 o'clock in the morning we're all for it, but by 7:15 we've gotten on the freeway and somehow forgotten all about it. So to give you an idea to start, years ago, Lori and I were out at the annual religious science conference at the Asilomar Conference Center out in Pacific Grove, Monterey, California area. And if you've never been there, it's a beautiful place. The state of California now owns and operates the conference center as one of the state parks out there. There's over 100 acres of grounds in the conference center, and it has the rolling dunes that go all the way down to the Pacific Ocean. And when you're there at the main building, there's a deck that you can sit on and just look out over the water. One day, Lori saw a whale migrating, heading south down the coast. Just spectacular. The breezes, you know, the dunes. The wild deer are tame. I mean, in the town of Pacific Grove, if you drive into Pacific Grove, you'll see a family of deer just walking down the street. The deer will come right up to you. Some people have had the deer come right up to them to be petted. Sometimes you're sitting in the dining hall there eating, and the deer will just come up and kind of pose right outside the window. It's just absolutely gorgeous place. And in the weekly conference, the conference ran for an entire week. The way that it was set up is that you could be doing something. You could be engaged in an organized activity from like 6 o'clock in the morning to 1 o'clock the following morning. There was something going on all the time. Start in the morning with meditation, and then a yoga class, and then there might be a brief morning prayer, and then breakfast, and then you would kind of go into these breakout sessions. And there's buildings all over this 100-acre campus, and there's breakout sessions in like 5 or 6 of them, simultaneous breakout sessions. And there's usually 2 slots. There's 2 time slots before lunch. So you choose. You have an itinerary. You kind of choose. Well, from 9 o'clock to 10:30 I'm going here, and then from 10:35 to noon I'm going there, and then it's lunch. So there's people kind of in the break between those breakout sessions. There's people just running wildly, trying to get from one side of the campus to the other side of the campus, and trying to figure out where to go. And they have these little maps, of course, a little map, and it tells you. You look up the name of the building. You're going to such and such a hall, and it tells you in this building located at coordinates E4 on the map. And then you have to figure out where you are, and you have to figure out where E4 is and get over there. And one day, Lori and I, we ducked into a little, they have little stores, little store buildings, snacks and coffee and things like that kind of scattered around. And we weren't going to a breakout session. We decided to just take it easy. And we stopped in, and we were getting a cold drink and something to eat. And we're sitting on this little deck outside the store. These 2 ladies come up, and they're very, very flustered. They're in a hurry, and they say, can you tell us how to get to, and they name the building, And the lady holds out a map for me to look at this map, and I said, sure, we can figure that out. And she holds out the map, and I start to look at the map, and no sooner do I start to look at the map, and she turns the map around so she can look at it, and she points to something, and she says, well, that's where we were this morning. And then she turns the map back around for me, and no sooner do I start to get oriented on the map than the other lady takes the map and turns it and says, well, that's where we were yesterday afternoon. And I couldn't help them, because they wouldn't stay still long enough for me to help them. Finally, I just physically took the map away, and I said, give me just a second. I turned the map around, got it oriented, looked at where they were going, and I said, you go right up that path right there. It's about a quarter mile up that hill. And as it happened, I said to myself, there's a message in that. There's a sermon in that, You got to be still. Where you were yesterday is of no importance today. It got you here, yes, but dwelling on yesterday is not going to help. Moving the map all around without trying to figure out where you are and where you want to be in relation to that isn't going to help you. You have to clarify. You have to get clear. You have to stop, and you have to say, wait a second. Here's where I am. Here's where I want to be. And this is how I get there. This is the path that I'm going to take from here to there. It's kind of just that simple. Clarify. I mentioned Napoleon Hill's book, Think and Grow Rich, and I assume everybody is at least heard of it, if not read it. But Napoleon Hill, to me it's an interesting story, because Napoleon Hill went and interviewed Andrew Carnegie, who was at the time the richest man in the world. I think dollar for dollar, if you adjust for inflation, Carnegie was richer than Bill Gates, to put it in perspective. And Carnegie, Napoleon Hill was a newspaper man, and Carnegie asked Hill if Hill would undertake this task of interviewing the most successful leaders in America and trying to determine what was going to be called the master key to success. What are the characteristics? What are the things that successful people do? And is there a way that these techniques could be taught to the ordinary person, so the ordinary person could also succeed? And of course, the entire history of America, if you look at America, is kind of based on this idea that, well, anybody who will just apply themselves, anybody who will work hard can succeed. Whether that's true or not, that's another discussion probably for the political arena. But my point is that that's the idea. People believe that idea. People buy into that. And Carnegie himself started out as a poor immigrant, 12-year-old lad coming over from Scotland, and he became the wealthiest man in America, in the world at the time. And he commissioned Napoleon Hill to try to figure out what is it that makes some people successful and other people not so successful. And Napoleon Hill spent 20 years investigating before he wrote his book. Just a side story here, he wrote the book and he didn't have a title for it. And the publisher said, you have to have a title. We're going to have to put a title on this and start printing the covers and doing the marketing work. What's the title? And Napoleon Hill couldn't think of it, couldn't think of a title. So the publisher told him, he said, listen, he said, if by tomorrow you don't have a title, he said, I'm going to give it a title. And the title's going to be, Use Your Noodle and Get the Boodle. And Napoleon Hill thought that was a terrible title and hung up the phone and he went to bed. And he said about 3 o'clock in the morning he sat straight up, and Think and Grow Rich was the title. But Napoleon Hill interviewed Andrew Carnegie. And Andrew Carnegie, I've done some research, and I can't remember the name, but there was kind of at the time, a new thought. There was like a lecture circuit, and there was new thought pioneers, if you will, who went around these. I think it was Wallace Wattles wrote the book, which became the foundation of the movie The Secret, and he was one of those around that time. And there was somebody else who Carnegie, I don't know if he followed is the right word, but he certainly was aware of this person and read his books. And Carnegie gave Napoleon Hill letters of introduction to 20 of the most successful people he knew, one of whom was Henry Ford. And Henry Ford, as I've mentioned before, Henry Ford loved Ralph Waldo Trine's book, In Tune with the Infinite, a New Thought book. And Ford used to buy it by the case, and he would give copies of it to all of the people he was in business with. You read this book, this is a good book. So I can imagine Napoleon Hill going around and interviewing these people and getting what we would recognize as new thought ideas fed back to him as the secrets or the techniques that they use. And in writing his book, Napoleon Hill said that the techniques that he was about to describe work because there's a spiritual law behind them. But he wasn't going to go into that spiritual law because people would think he was trying to teach them a new religion, and he was not. He was just trying to teach them how to be successful. And the first step was clarification. The first step was to identify what is it that you want. He called it your chief purpose in life, your main chief purpose in life, I think he called it. And Hill says that everything starts with desire. Desire is a starting point of all achievement. And I just want to touch on that briefly because we have a love-hate relationship with desire in our culture and in our ideas that affect our spiritual growth. So you have heard, and we have been taught, that desire comes from the ego and the intellect, and the human expression of desire is usually grasping or aversion. Right? This comes from Buddhism, grasping or aversion. We want to get that which we find pleasurable, and we want to avoid that which we find painful. That is kind of the basics of human motivation, right? Their salespeople know it. Salespeople will use it. Politicians know it. If you want to get somebody to do something, what do? You show them how by doing what you want them to do, they're going to get more of what they want. Or if they don't do what you want them to do, they're going to get more of what they don't want. And that's kind of, in very simplistic terms, that's where the human life is. So we have been told in the spiritual path that desire brings pain and suffering, right? Because that which we desire, that which we cling to, that's which we grasp for, that which brings us pleasure eventually brings us pain. we get it, we have it, we want more of it. It's like the people who have $500 million, but they need 6 or they need 7. The football players who are making $40 million a year, and they think that's a lot of money until they find out somebody on the other team is making 50. And then it's not really about the money; it's about the ego, and I want more, those kind of things. But as Buddha's teachings would tell us, once we get that thing that brings us pleasure, whatever it happens to be, the person or the situation or the substance or the job, the car, the house, you name it. Once we have it, well, then it's not so satisfying anymore. Then we want more of it. Or maybe we're afraid we're going to lose it. What happens if we don't get to keep this? And even though we have it, the idea that we might lose it becomes painful. So this idea then that along the spiritual path, our desires can lead us away from our spiritual path, and desires are something that, if we could completely eliminate desires, then we would eliminate the pain and the suffering, right? If we could just be in the isness, be in the suchness. So we have this idea, we get taught this idea from time to time in workshops and seminars that, well, what you should really want is to let go of all desires. And Lori and I were studying with a man who was from India, and he was a professor of philosophy at the UNC Chapel Hill. And he taught classes in basic world religion and Hinduism out at the Hindu temple by the airport in Raleigh in Morrisville, North Carolina. And we had I would say it was a privilege, because it was a wonderful experience in my life to be there. And he was talking about this point, and he said, isn't the desire to have no desires, isn't that still a desire? And I thought, what a great question. What a great question. So without quite understanding everything, we might read a book or listen to a talk and it says, just be desireless. And we think, well, that's great. I want to be desireless. But you got to hold your map still, see? We're not there yet. We're not there yet. Ultimately, we might think that the human desire, the way we experience it, perhaps as an appetite. You get hungry, you have a desire to eat. The human desire, as it exists, will be transcended. Can you think of, the divine? What is the divine desire? The divine has everything. But then you kind of get into the idea, well, it desires to express itself. It desires to experience itself. It desires to enjoy itself. Joy is a motive force. Well, aren't they desires? You see, aren't they, as best we can understand the ineffable, aren't they desires? So we want to come today, we want to come to this point of saying the idea of the egoless self, the idea of the desireless self is an ideal. But in order to get there, we have to desire to get there. So it is not all desire that is something that we want to be without, nor is it even possible, I would say, as we go through our daily life, we get hungry, we get thirsty, there are things that we want to accomplish in terms of our job and all those things. So the way that the world is set up now, there are certain things certain desires that give a greater expression to life. And there are certain desires that take us away from the primary purpose, the experience of the presence of God. Desire is the starting point of all achievement, according to Napoleon Hill. And I would say that that is true in our spiritual life as well. We have to desire God. We have to desire the experience of God. We have to truly desire the experience of God. Not just talk about it, not just sing about it, not just hold hands and sway about it. but truly, truly desire that experience. And the desires that we want to let go of are the egotistical desires that would take us away from that experience of God. And the desires that we want to fan into a white-hot flame, is the way that Hill puts it. Those that are desires for a greater expression of life, a greater expression of love, a greater expression of truth, greater expression of beauty, as Dr. Holmes would tell us. Desires that do not harm another in another way, desires that do not take anything away from another. So you might say rightful desires, or you might say good desires. However you want to couch that, however you want to look at that. What is it that you want? What is it that you want? So this first step, this clarifying, what do you want? I'll give you two examples from the secular life. I'll give you one, the Wright brothers and powered flight, the first successful powered flight. I realize there are people who will say that other aviators may have flown first, perhaps, but they not only flew, the Wright brothers, but they popularized the idea. They knew what they wanted. They knew what they wanted when they left Dayton, Ohio, and got on the train and came down to Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. They chose Kitty Hawk, North Carolina because of the consistent sea breezes that were there, that would allow them to tether their airplane like a kite in the breeze and allow them to practice controlling. See, up until that point, what people were doing was they were building like a wing, strapping it to their back and running off the side of a mountain and gliding. All they could do was glide. There was no control. And of course, once something happened, the wind would blow or an air current would come up, something would happen to imbalance the plane. They would die. Usually they would crash, and in many cases they would die. So the problem was not getting into the air. The problem was controlling the aircraft once they got into the air. And Kitty Hawk was a perfect place. They could watch the seagulls as the seagulls kind of hovered in the breeze, and they warped their wings, and that's how they maintained their balance. You know, you can kind of, if you've ever been at the beach and watched the seabirds, they kind of twist their wings back and forth, and that's how they stay stable. And the Wright brothers came up with a technique of moving levers and cables that warped the wing, but they knew what they wanted. They wanted to successfully control the plane, because once they could control the plane, then they could put an engine on it. There was no engines available at the time to do that. They made one out of a block of metal. They made an engine. They knew what they wanted. See, they weren't down in Kitty Hawk by accident. They weren't doing the things they were doing willy-nilly. They knew what they wanted. They were very clear. They were very clear as to their intentions. They were going to control flight and put an engine on a plane, and they were going to demonstrate powered flight, not just gliding. That's what they wanted. That's what they were clear about. That's what they did. Another example is Henry Ford and the V8 engine. Henry Ford, of course, seemed to be a man of very strong opinions. Some of them we would agree with, and some of them not so much. But the story goes that at one point he wanted an 8-cylinder engine in one single block. And of course, nobody had done anything like that up until that point in time. And he went to his engineers and he told them, "I want an 8-cylinder engine in a single block." And they said, "Well, it can't be done." And he said, "Well, you don't have anything else to do. I'm taking all your other projects away from you. That's what you're going to work on." He came back to them in 6 months' time and he said, "How are you doing?" And they said, "It can't be done." And he said, "Well, I'll tell you what." He said, "I'm going to give you another 6 months. And if you can't do it, then I'm going to get rid of you, and I will get some new engineers in here until I find somebody that can do it." And he came back within the next 6 months, they had the breakthrough in their thinking, and they thought, well, if you put 4 cylinders on each side, you could put 8 cylinders in a block if you put each cylinder block in a V formation. And that's how they came up with the V8 engine. The reason that Napoleon Hill tells that story is that he knew what he wanted. He knew what he wanted. Clarify, clarify, clarify. And then there's commitment. You see, what is it that they were willing to do in order to have that? The Wright brothers, put their fortune on the line from their bicycle shop. They came down to Kitty Hawk. They paid their expenses. Henry Ford was willing to take every other project away from these people and tell them, this is it. This is what you're going to do. And then there's the famous story of Spartacus, that landed the troops on the shore and then burned the ships and said, we win or we die. There's no going back. We're fully committed. We're fully committed. So what we want to do is we want to look at these ideas then as it comes to our spiritual life. What is the most important thing that we will ever discover here on earth? Keep thine eyes single. We come back to this idea of the New Testament. And just briefly there, Matthew 5, 6, and 7 is what is referred to as the Sermon on the Mount. And scholars will tell us that the Sermon on the Mount is kind of like the encapsulated summation of what Jesus taught when he was here on earth. Not the teachings about Jesus. That constitutes many of the different Christian religions, teachings about Jesus. But these are the teachings of Jesus, and it's probably never happened the way that it's described. It's a literary device that an author uses to create this story in order to bring forth these ideas. And the very setting, Sermon on the Mount, you can imagine people sitting on the hillside up in different rows, kind of like if you're in a big auditorium, how the each row of seats is up higher than the other. You can imagine, a couple thousand years ago, people could just sit on a hill. And they would all sit on the hill, but each of them would have a clear view of the speaker. And the speaker is standing there on the hill, talking to them. And the Hindu term Upanishad means a teaching received at the feet of the master. Right? So the students were sitting at the feet of the master, and the master is speaking. So this is kind of the setting that you have there. And in this, see, when I was thinking consistency and clarity and commitment, and then keep thine eye single came, to me this is what Jesus is telling the people. Okay? But we have to say, well, what does this mean, keep thine eye single? Because it's, obviously we have 2 eyes. It's not, he's not talking about going around wearing an eye patch or something silly like that. But if we look in the previous verses, he's telling them, he says, wherever your treasure is, that's where your heart is, your subconscious mind. Whatever you value, that's what's telling you what's truly important to you. Right? If you want to look at what people really believe, look at where their treasure is. What is it that they hold valuable? And he said to them, don't waste time gathering up things that will rust and the moths will eat. Don't waste time gathering up the things of the earth. But treasure the spiritual things. Keep thine eyes single. And it's like a light. Your eyes are like a light, and it will let the light in, and the light will affect your whole being, your whole body, your whole existence. What is the most important thing to us in this life as we go through this life? Experiencing our soul, perhaps. That's what I'm suggesting. But we have to keep our eyes single on that. We have to keep ourselves focused to that. We have to clarify. We have to clarify. You may remember the movie An Officer and a Gentleman. Richard Gere and Louis Gossett Jr. were kind of like the 2 main characters who carried the movie forward. And Richard Gere was kind of like an undisciplined young man who wanted to join the Navy and fly jets. And in order to do so, he had to go through basic training with a Marine drill sergeant played by Louis Gossett Jr. Of course, every basic training movie ever made, there's always this big confrontational scene between the protagonist and the drill sergeant where they're going to have to come together and duke it out and see who's the toughest, And that movie was no exception. But there's a part in the movie where Louis Gossett Jr. is telling Richard Gere, you're not going to get through here because that's up to me, and I'm not going to let somebody as undisciplined as you get through here and fly jets. And Richard Gere's character starts to melt down, and he starts crying, and all he can say is, I only want to fly jets. I only want to fly jets. I only want to fly jets. And he's just kind of incoherent. He's just standing there babbling like a baby, saying, I only want to fly jets. I only want to fly jets. He was clear. He was clear. I only want thee. I only want thee, is what Augustine tells us. I ask nothing of thee, not even thy love. I only want thee. So when it comes to terms of success, if we can even call it that, success in our spiritual life, we have to start with clarity. We have to just start with, what is it that you desire? I only want thee. I only want thee. Now, we may come to it in different ways. We may say, well, I want health, or I want supply in the form of money flowing through my life, or I want loving relationships. I want to experience the love of God in relationship with a significant other. We may say that I want fulfilling activities in my life. I want meaningful work, not drudgery. And all of these things are just different ways of us experiencing the activity and the presence of God in our lives. Ernest Holmes tells us, with all you're getting, you first have to get God. Joel Goldsmith says, don't even think about those other things. Think only about God. Right? So it's the difference between the Gnostic and the mystical. If I wish a greater experience of life, I need to know God more in some way. That's the Gnostic view. The mystical view is, I don't need to worry about anything else if I know God. So I only want thee. I only want thee. Look at your map. Where are you on your growth, your spiritual growth? Where are you? Where are you? Where do you want to be? Can you clarify that? Can you clarify that? And then can you commit yourself to it? Do you really want that? Do you really want that? Do you want it as much as you would a pond if your hair is on fire? How committed are you to that? I once had a conversation with a man from India who was poking fun at American religion. He thought so. He thought he was doing so at my expense because I had been introduced to him as a minister. And he said, Americans go to church Sunday at 11 o'clock, and they hold hands, and they sing, and they sway, and they feel really good. And then Monday morning, they go right back to being what they were on Friday. He said, in India, it's constant growth, constant practice. He explained it to me in terms of learning to play a musical instrument. You don't go back to your teacher without having practiced the drills the teacher gave you the last time you saw him or her, because they can't teach you anymore if you haven't done your work. And he said Americans are like a student who goes back to the music teacher every week but never practices in between. And of course the American teachers are happy to have you come back and pay your 15 or 20 bucks, whatever you pay for your lessons, So how committed are we? How committed are we? Do we know what it is that we want in terms of our spiritual growth? If I only want thee is a little bit too abstract, can we put it in kind of more tangible terms? I want to experience love. I want to experience health. I want to experience enough and plenty supply in my life. I want to experience fulfillment in my activities. I want to experience my perfect spiritual path. Perhaps that helps us to look at our map. Just keep in mind that however we describe it, health or wealth or love, creative self-expression, spiritual attunement, however we define it, what we really want is God. What we really want is God. So I usually tell people, work at both levels. Work at the mystical level of saying, I just want to sit and I want to be at home with Thee, and take a period of meditation at least once a day, if not several times a day, to just simply sit and be still and know. And then take some time to be specific, to go into a specific treatment for the specific circumstances. If that's where you're at in your map, that's fine. That's fine. It's not one or the other. Eventually it will become the other. I only want Thee. But if we're not there yet, it's okay. What is it that we want? What is it that you can commit to? What is it that you're going to stay with? What is it that you're going to give of your life and your fortune and your sacred honor? Clarify, commit, and then the last part is to be consistent. And I think for many of us, the consistency part is kind of the hard part. It's easy for us to think about what we want. It's easy for us to say, and to really mean when we say it, that we are willing to do whatever needs to be done. Like the Wright brothers, we don't know what we're going to find when we get to Kitty Hawk, but we'll figure it out when we get there. We don't know how to build an engine for an airplane, but we'll figure it out when we have to. Do the next thing. What's in front of you right now? Are you willing to commit to do that? Are you willing to commit to do that? When I was learning how to fly, I was flying out of a field in Fremont, California. It's not there anymore. We were flying gliders, and it was very close to San Jose International Airport. And there was a change in the Federal Aviation regulations that required planes that close to an airport to have transponders. And because the glider didn't have an electrical system, we couldn't have transponders. But nevertheless, we would be flying. When I was there, we would be flying, and we would be circling in the air, riding the thermals up. And you look out the window, and a few miles away, there was a plane on final descent into San Jose. And one of my instructors was a Navy pilot. He was stationed at Moffett Field, but he flew off of a carrier. And he told me, when we were learning how to fly, I went out one day and it was just very marginal weather. The wind was blowing, the rain was coming off and on. You had little breaks where you could fly, and then you have to wait. And I went for a lesson, and it was very difficult. You're on a tow rope and you're bouncing around. And he said, "Why did you come and fly on such a miserable day?" And I said, "Because I want to be a pilot. I want to learn how to fly." He said, "Well, he said most people they just want to fly in fair weather." He said, "I admire your determination." He said, "As a Navy pilot," he says, "I leave the carrier and I go fly and I do my mission." He says, "And it would be nice if when I got back, if the seas were flat and the winds were steady, and it was daylight." He said, "But that's not always the case. But once you take off, you've made a commitment that you'll land." You ever think about that? How once you take off, you're going to have to land that plane somewhere. He says, so you just come back and you circle the carrier and you deal with whatever's there. You deal with whatever's there. You do what needs to be done. Right? Are you committed to do what needs to be done for your spiritual growth? Are you clear on what your spiritual growth looks like to you at this point in your life? Are you committed to do what needs to be done? And then the last part is consistency. Consistency, consistency. Are you doing it daily? Are you doing it every chance you get? When I was learning to sell, there was another book that I read besides Think and Grow Rich, It was called How I Raised Myself from Failure to Success in Selling, and the author's name is Frank Bettcher, Betcher. And Mr. Bettcher said that he was an insurance salesman, and he was failing at being an insurance salesman. And he actually went to the office to clean out his desk and quit. And the area manager called in, and they called an all-hands meeting, and it was a pep rally, you know, and they got everybody in the auditorium, and the manager said, listen, he says, if you will show me a man who will go out and earnestly tell our story to 3 new people a day, I will show you someone who can make a living selling insurance. He said, if you show me somebody who's failing, they are not doing that. It is just that simple. So Bettcher said, you know, he didn't like that idea, but because it made him seem like he wasn't doing what he could do. But he decided to keep track of himself. He decided to make himself accountable, to be consistent. So he came up with an index card system and a calendar system, and he went back and he looked at his calendar over the last month or so, and he realized that he wasn't prospecting. He wasn't meeting 3 new people a day. He was going around and visiting old people and going to the barbershop and doing all sorts of things, but he wasn't doing the very bread and butter, essential thing that salespeople need to do, which is to find clients. So he made a commitment to himself that he would be consistent, and he would keep track of himself. And at the end of every day, he would look and see how well he did. And I think it was W. Clement Stone who said that if your day was a social success, it was a business failure. And Bettcher kind of discovered that. And he realized over time then that, yes, if he went out and he saw just 3 people a day, he could make a living. And then he started to use that data to further clarify. Some clients were worth more than others in terms of what they bought. How could he find more of those clients? And he just became efficient and effective at what he did. And he became a very, very successful salesperson. Well, the same technique applies to anything that we do in life, you know. Can we stop at the end of the day and reflect? Can you stop at the end of the day and ask yourself, how consistent have I been today in keeping my mind stayed on Thee, and keeping my eyes single, in focusing on the treasures of heaven, the treasure of the presence of God? Or have I followed, the internet is terrible, have I followed the kind of like the crazy trail? There was a cartoon in the Sunday papers, used to be called The Family Circus, and it's about a bunch of little children growing up in a family. And there's one about the mom says to the little guy, you know, where have you been? And he said, well, I came straight home from school. And then they show you the map of, you know, he came from school and he went to the playground, and then he went to the candy store, and then he went for an ice cream cone, you know, and then he went to grandma's house, and then finally he came back home. Well, we wander, you know. Osho says our mind is like a stray dog and we follow it. So did we follow every little interesting thing that came into our lives today? And if so, did we do it at the expense of what we said was the most important thing in our life, which is our spiritual growth? So we must be consistent, and however that works for you, you have to find a way to be consistent, whether it's putting it on your calendar, setting your alarm clock, whatever you need to do to find a way to be consistent. Some people create a little sacred space in their home, a little altar with candles and pictures of religious figures and things like that. But just something that says when you're in this place, it's special. Dennis Merritt Jones, Dr. Dennis Merritt Jones at Asilomar one year asked people how many had a special room in their house to clean their bodies, you know, and everybody raised their hand. You know, we've all got a shower and a bath. He said, how many people have a special place to clean your mind? Do you have some place where you can go and be consistent? Light some incense so that your body gets used to the smell and says, now's the time that we're going to be consistent. Now's the time that we're going to be serious about our spiritual growth. Whatever way works for you, you have to find that. If you don't have it yet, you have to find that. You have to be consistent. And then you have to check in at the end of the day and ask yourself, honestly, how well did I do? How well did I do against what I said I was going to do? And tomorrow just be a little bit better. And the day after that be a little bit better. Keep thine eye single, right? Another way to interpret that is there's only God. There's only God. There's only God. Right? Dr. Holmes tells us that all of the problems that we face in life can be tracked down to the same cause, which is a belief in duality. We believe in good and evil. That's what Genesis tells us, right? The knowledge of good and evil is what got us out of the garden, and we've been trying to get back to eat from the tree of life ever since. And what happens when we eat of the tree of life? Our eye is single. There is only God. So consider, if you will, the utterance of Augustine. Maybe you want to take a little index card and put the 3 C's, one inside the other, to remind yourself: clarify, commit, be consistent. And under that, put the words of Augustine: I ask nothing of thee, not even thy love. I only want thee. So I invite you to take some time today, this week. What is it that you desire with respect to your spiritual growth? Can you clarify that? What are you willing to do? What are you willing to commit to that? And then how are you going to hold yourself accountable and be consistent? And then execute. Then execute. You have to follow. Right? You have to do your plan. Do these things, and your eye will be single. You will be the light. You will experience the light. You will feel the light in every aspect of your being. And so it is.